I'm really very happy to be here at the New York Studio School with you this evening and talking about Vuillard and Bonnard and their cohorts, especially at the beginning of their development when they were still in their early 20s, especially into their 30s and a little bit after that, in a talk I'm calling Verging on Vuillard, as it was said, etc. It's about some of their most wonderful works and their early inventions, beginning in the late 1880s and into the 1890s and beyond. Some of my thoughts were occasioned by the exhibition Beyond the Easel that Gloria Groom, who's a curator at the Chicago Art Institute, put together, and which was at the Art Institute, and I spoke there about some of the roots of the development of the decorative aesthetic. And it was also here, and I hope some of you saw it last spring at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The term Beyond the Easel came from the artists themselves, and it meant that they were not only anchored in easel painting, that there were other things they were going to do and other things they were going to try out. Many of them that we'll be seeing tonight, a sampling anyway of many of them. And I want to begin by showing some of these glorious works and giving you a sense of the spectrum of the kinds of things they were interested in doing and the ways they approached them, and then dip backward a little bit and look at some of the roots and sources for the things that they came up with. On the left, I'm showing you to begin with, could it be a little bit more focused, please? I'll be showing you a group of works on the left and details from on the right. And I'm going to begin with a flurry of works to give you a sense of what we're talking about. I'm showing you first Edward Vuillard, V-U-I-L-L-A-R-D, as you all know. And the work is called the Jardin Public, the public garden. It's actually more panels than you see here. And on the right is a detail of the little girl's face that you see there. And this is one of the works that they would have said was not an easel painting as such, because it was related panels that were meant to be put, many of them, into folding screens. These not necessarily. These could have been independent works, and yet they interrelate with one another, and some of them could have been then put into folding screens. And although I'm not going to be talking about Japonism, that is what the French called the Japanese influence in their work, in one of the great important sources for all the work I'm going to be showing you is, in fact, Japanese art, because there was an influx starting in the 1860s that was promoted by such people as Siegfried Bing, who was a great commercial dealer and was very much on top of anything that was new that could be introduced to France and to other countries, and he brought in, he was one of the people to bring in Japanese works. So when you look, for example, even at the format of these very narrow, tall works, and you'll be seeing other formats, one great source is Japanese work, as is some of the flat, we'll be looking at flat, geometric patterning, and that also comes from the woodcuts and so forth that were very much beloved by these artists, and critics were even by the 1880s and 1890s, especially younger critics coming on board and approving of this Japanese art, which at first had attracted mostly painters. The group of artists who we're going to be talking about in about 1888, many of them came together. I'm going to be talking about just 3 or 4 of them really. But there were about 12 of them who called themselves prophets, as of prophets of a new art and a new painting. And they used the Hebrew word for prophets, the nabis, nabi in singular, N-A-B-I, or the nabis in French for the plural. Perhaps it was a slightly pretentious way of talking about themselves as prophets of a new art, but actually, as you'll see, I think that it turned out that they were able to fulfill their self-appointed promise. Also in this group, although he was older, but he wasn't in the group, but in the 1890s came to exhibit with them, is Odilon Redon, who I'll be showing you in a moment too, as part of interacting with the group of people I'll be talking about. The group as such didn't outlast the century, didn't outlast the 19th century, and people tended then to go their own aesthetic ways, though that many of them remained the best of friends. And for the most part, they remained committed decorative painters. And I shall center on their production of these non-easel paintings and the aesthetic they developed for these works. As I said at the beginning, and first let me point out some of the things that are true of this painting before we go on to the next. You notice that this is a public garden, and it shows scenes of ladies and little girls out in the garden. It's a kind of Arcadian scene brought up to date. There isn't any particular narrative or storytelling or literary underpinnings for this. You don't have to know mythology. It's a scene of everyday Parisian life, but at its very best, it's a sort of idyllic scene of nice things going on, charming scenes, and we'll be seeing these again and again. And when perhaps we get to a discussion later, one of the earmarks of these decorative paintings is, in fact, that they're almost invariably pleasant, wonderful, lovely scenes that people would like to have, and they were very keen, these artists, on selling their work, that scenes that people would like to have, perhaps, and buy and put in their homes. So we have a kind of non-narrative that, and often garden scenes that are part and parcel of the work of this group. You'll also notice that on the right there's something that is quite new in the this is in the 1890s. Vuillard, at least, and we'll be seeing this over and over in his work, often doesn't define his forms and whether it's figures or whether it's plants or whether it's a hat or whatever with outlines, but rather dabs opaque colors, pattern colors that are sort of rise to the surface of the canvas. And in this case, it's oils, but it could well be distemper, and we'll be talking about some of the medium that he liked and other artists liked. The main part about that was that it was a non-reflective paint. It was not varnished kind of oils with linseed oil or transparent glazes, but rather a matte surface that was very chalky. And as there aren't outlines around the figures and everything tend to coalesce and sort of meld together so that there's less and less of a differentiation between, say, the patterning of the figure of the girl and the pebbles behind her. And also part of this is a great flattening into two-dimensionality of whether it's the landscape or the figures, that you don't have a sense of perspective of a three-dimensionality with the piercing of the canvas, but rather the landscape is kind of tilted upward and pretty much, especially as you see on the right, is one with the pictorial surface itself. And that would also be very important in this new art and caused older traditional critics to complain bitterly about it. May I have the next on the next on the right, please? And now you see this is a detail, a quite beautiful detail of the face of the woman on the far left. There, the yellow, wearing the yellow dress, you see, and hat. So you can see some of the way in which Edward Vuillard just daubed and patched colors together, and you can even see in the kind of leaving the matter itself of the paint on the pictorial surface. Can we have the next on the right, please? And the next on the left. Oh, sorry. Well, that was the little girl that we had just seen before with the mother in a somewhat better slide. And you see the patterning of the ground and so forth again and how they all come together. Can I have the next on the left, please? Good, thank you, that's much better. Yeah, so you can see that. In the 1890s, At its beginnings in 1888, the group of artists, Edward Vuillard, Bonnard, who we'll be seeing in a little bit, etc., were all artists in their early 20s. Bonnard and Vuillard, Maurice Denis and Roussel, were born within 3 years of each other between 1867 and 1870, and they knew each other intimately. Vuillard, Roussel, and Denis were high school classmates from the Lycée Condorcet, and Roussel was to marry Vuillard's sister. And then Bonnard met all three of them when he was 20, and then Bonnard, Vuillard, and Denis, along with the budding writer Lunier-Pouet, shared a studio together near Place Pigalle, which was a hotbed of artist studios at the time. In the 1890s, speaking for the Nabis, this group of artists who came together, Bonnard said that above all, painting should be decorative. It is about the meaning of that term and how it came to be, the challenge that all painting should be decorative, that I want also to focus. He did not say, for example, that painting should be realistic or historically accurate, or depict heroic events, or be sun-filled, or depict human bodies idealistically, all of which had been rallying cries earlier in the century. Now, can we have the next two, please? This on the left is a painting, and on the right a detail from that painting of Vuillard's, another of Vuillard's wall-sized paintings of the late 1890s, this one of 1899, but he did a series of them around from 1895 through till 1899. This one is called Window Overlooking the Woods, and it's at the Chicago Art Institute, and it's some 8 feet high by about 12 feet long. And I want to look at it to see, again, what some of the other qualities are of Vuillard's work in this non-easel painting type. Unlike his domestic interiors, this mural-sized painting is really in praise of the lush French countryside at different seasons you'll be seeing. It's a place to go for a walk, inviting the viewer to explore visually with the unexpected little nooks and crannies. The landscape offers slightly more adventure than a cultivated garden, but is perfectly protected with the reassuring presence of the house, as you see on the left, and the woman in the house. In a way, we're supposed to identify with her, I think, because there's a sill on the painting itself on the left, and I'll be talking about the borders in a moment. And we're also view the countryside. You can either say that it's tilted up for us to see it all, or that we ourselves are as if we are in a second-story window looking at this kind of tapestry of colors opening up before us. And it's no coincidence that I talk of tapestry, because over and over again, when art critics were interested in this work but saw that it was really very different from what they were used to, they referred to this work as being tapestry-like or decorative. And in that sense, that it was acceptable, but they kept saying, but it's not a real painting. And tapestry was often likened to the works that people then, that were very large, and that had this kind of matte finish and patterning and kind of stitches of color, and again, very much like tapestry, a non-reflective surface as we have here. But the Nabi landscapes are basically Arcadian. They're not huge, awe-inspiring alpine peaks or the wild waves of a marine landscape, which one would associate with, say, Romantic painting earlier in the century, but rather the fresh outdoors that one might go to on a weekend getaway, with a whole village of houses nearby, a vale, and then a neighboring hill. Can I have the next on the right, please? And I can't step off the platform because I'll die, but I hope that you can see that you can explore visually in this very large painting, and I keep thinking of Jackson Pollock in the sense of it taking up all of your side vision and your front vision and so forth, and where there's all kinds of incident, and it's also not of one focus, where like looking at a Pollock or like really looking at Chinese painting, where you're invited to have your eyes visually dart in and about and be an active person finding things. There's a kind of hide and seek I think, interaction that can take place between the viewer and the imagery, so that, for example, you can locate this little woman going down through all these things that are happening, and all the activity. One sees a profile of a woman, for example, or a little horse behind her, or a steeple, and it's very inviting in that way that it promises you and rewards you for looking and finding these hidden details, something that Vuillard would do over and over again in his large paintings, as would Bonnard as well. May I have the next on the right, please? So that you see again, you can come in then and see these details, and you can see how he's handling the paint, and some of these are quite small and lovely. And then the next on the right, please. There, that sort of, it has a certain mischievousness and a wit to it that we'll see is true also of Bonnard's work. And the next on the right, please. And I'm showing you a much later painting by Vuillard, which we won't be getting into his late work, where you see this was done for the Princess Bibescu. She and her husband were Romanian patrons of the arts and patrons to Vuillard and Bonnard, who enjoyed the great patronage of a number of people we'll be talking to, and in that sense were able to do a number of these decorative paintings for people's homes, and often on commission. But you see in her quite luxurious, wonderful interior of, in the background on the right, a kind of painting with a border such as he himself did, and how it would have been in suggesting to you the destination for these kinds of paintings. Can I have the next on the right, please? I'm sorry, go back on the right. And I do want to talk about the borders in a little bit, but what I want you to look at now is that there are borders going around the painting and a number of his paintings, and here you have ornamented borders that it's one thing that that's true of it, and I'll be talking about the sources, is that it controls the outer perimeters of the painting, and it also brings pictorial weight and activity to the outer perimeters of a painting. And one of the interesting things about these paintings, and again one can think of Pollock, for example, is that it is an all-over composition. That is to say, it doesn't weight down in the traditional way in the lower portion, say, of the painting. It doesn't have a focus, a central focus, or even in Mannerist work, say, a focus off to the side, but rather it's the interest, both pictorial in the kind of pictorial weight and visually, is all over, and rather in an even way over the whole surface in the whole pictorial format. In that sense, we'll be seeing it really is like tapestry and some of the decorative arts before. But it's also true that Vuillard would take that kind of idea of the all-overness and introduce it into many of his later easel paintings, and later on I'll be showing you some of his intimist paintings of a much more modest interiors, which contrast wildly with the painting, for example, later on when he did paintings on commission and paintings of very luxurious interiors. Can I have the next two, please? Now, this around 1912, this is also true. What we've said about Vuillard is true of Bonnard's Arcadian park garden scenes. These he did. I'm going to be showing you several that he did for his Russian patrons. The Morozovs were very interested in and great patrons of Bonnard, and came to Paris, and there was a kind of rivalry between Shukin, the other great patron of the arts in the teens, who was hired Matisse to do his stairwell, so Morozov hired Bonnard to do his stairwell, so Shukin bought some more things from Matisse, so Morozov bought some more things from Bonnard, and of course it's a fabulous, really fabulous and wonderful rivalry that they had in outdoing each other with extraordinary paintings and things coming from Paris. Now, just as in what we saw, and again we have a detail on the right of the large painting, which is over 12 feet tall, and now in the Pushkin Museum in Moscow on the left and right from Morozov's home, is the painting of the seasons, which were often, and historically the seasons are very popular and fashionable to decorate villas from the Renaissance in Italy, often the spring, summer, winter, fall, and often dining rooms showing landscapes in these different seasons. And here, Bonnard did only 2 of the seasons, spring and fall. The one on the left is called spring. And squeeze it, the early spring in the countryside, there's a tree with enormous leafy branches dominating it, as you see here, and near it, children are gambling about, and a large woman lolls near a pond. And then to the side, there are some lovers who are cavorting, whom you can kind of make out in amongst the trees. There on the right, the far right, as you see. And there is, as I said, no narrative here and no literary underpinnings, but it's filled with incident all over, and in this bucolic work. Here, too, as in Vuillard, the space is pressed out, and the ground is upended to be virtually parallel to the forward picture plane, and the whole is shown with a very gentle humor and a fanfare of colors for which Bonnard, of course, would be famous all of his life. And could I have the next on the right, please? Now on the next on the left. This is its pair, which is called Autumn Fruit Picking in the Pushkin, where there, again, it's dominated with an enormous tree with abundant fruit and figures appearing here and there through the whole expanse of the canvas. And there's a figure, for example, curled up with a bunch of grapes that you can see in a bower on the left. Can we have the next on the right, please? You see these people, there she is, with some grapes. And part of the pleasure of viewing the piece is that you don't have to see it all from one perspective. And I think it was partly done perhaps because it was in Morozov's house, it was planned to be near a staircase. These paintings were on either side of the great staircase, and I think that as one ascended or descended the staircase, always the viewer changing position, that there was so many incidents to be seen at the different levels, I think must have been very nice with that staircase and done with that in mind. Can we have the next 2, please? So that these are pastorals, and this continues in the work of Maurice Denis, D-E-N-I-S, who was also one of the members of the group. And besides being an artist, he was a great writer. And from the time he was 17, he wrote diaries of, and even earlier, but diaries of what he saw and what exhibitions he went to and what he thought of it. And I'll be coming back to him in a moment because he was very instrumental in articulating what a decorative aesthetic ought to be and what was important about it. On the left, I'm showing you a painting that he did in 1894. Many of you may have seen it in the exhibition, it was there, as was the screen on the right of about the same year. And it was the one on the left was it's a tondo, a shaped canvas in a circular format. And we'll be speaking about those shaped canvases, of which there are many in this kind of decorative work. It was done for a ceiling of Ernest Chausson, the composer, who was a great patron of these artists, and Maurice Denis in particular, but the others, and was also the brother-in-law, for those of you, of Henri Lerolle, who was also a painter and a great patron of this group. You also notice, of course, and it goes without saying, especially in the New York Studio School, that the tondo shape it determines to a great extent the shape of the figures and figurations within it, and of course also the floating ladies with their round panier, with their round baskets with flowers overflowing it. Again, this kind of bucolic idea. You do have more of a feeling on the right for what was true of many of Vuillard's work as well as Denis' work, and that's the blanched, chalky whiteness. And I will be talking about Puvis de Chavannes, the artist on whom I work so much. And some people, as we get to him, but just foreshadowing that in a way, said that he started this epidemic of white that was to take over so many people's art in the 1890s, what they called a contagion de blanc, a contagiousness, an epidemic of white. Can I have the next on the left? But what white does, of course, when it besides being opaque, it does reduce all these whitened pastel-y colors that Denis was particularly taken with. It does tend to give an equal value to whatever it is you see before you, and again, this evenness, so that you have more of a sense of interlocking, flat colors. And I show you the screen both on the right, where you see this it's spread out, but also really many of these things are meant to be in regular environments where they would in fact be folded up and so forth, so that it becomes that much more, to see it as it's pictured on the right in a catalog is really not to see it as it would be in someone's home, where you see the really very interesting way he works out the fencing, both as it complements and contradicts the actual folding and interrelationship of the panels of the screen, which sets up a certain rhythm that's very complicated and really very lovely. Now, the screens, as I said, were very much introduced in imitation of Japanese screens, and we'll be coming back to screens in a bit. The next two, please. Finally, talking about another aspect of their work, and this is Aristide Maillot. Before he became a sculptor, he was originally a painter and was a part of this group, and then from painting also then was very interested into weave in tapestries, so that this tapestry, which is in Copenhagen, is very interesting and not atypical of the tapestries he did. You have the colors narrowed down to a certain color chords that are in the neutral range, and then again you have the borders, which I'll talk about, and you have the stitching, which itself has its own patterning to it. Again, it's a very pleasant bucolic scene. This lady's playing musical instruments out in a park and using the trees and the foliage and the flowers for ornamental patterning, which is then repeated in the borders, that kind of patterning. Can I have the next on the right, please? And there's a slide showing you how he uses the stitching and the textures. So that in all these works, the lines become very arbitrary because they're part of a rhythm. The textures become very much autonomous and don't describe figures and don't describe textures of the actual world around, but actually take on their own patterning. The compositions are very much developed to be two-dimensional. So that all of these things are not traditional in the sense of what the academy, for example, was teaching that a painting should be. A painting or a tableau was considered very different from a décoration or a decoration. A tableau was supposed to have perspective. A tableau was supposed to have and chiaroscuro, and it was in every way to be different from these decorations. Could I have the next two, please? Now, going into how these young artists got together, they came together, as I say, in 1888, and one of the things they did was not only paintings but commercial art, what was viewed with a very viewed askance by some critics, that they would not just stick to fine arts or high arts, but do posters and do, as we'll be seeing, screens and bases and so forth. And now in the 21st century, we think it's old hat that artists can do whatever they please, and that you can engage in what we would call applied arts or minor arts, what were considered applied arts or minor arts at the time. But this was changing in the 1890s. The status of people who would be doing decorative arts, so to speak, was much lower, and people who went to study how to do that thing generally didn't go to a high art school. It's as if the New York Studio School suddenly decided, I suppose, to do, I don't know, what could be more horrifying? I don't know, fashion design? I have no idea. So people were horrified at the idea that these people were doing this, many things at once. Now, Bonnard, when he was about 21, won a contest for the poster on the right, celebrating champagne, with a kind of a very effervescent figure holding up a champagne. And that the fact that he would, in fact, not only engage in doing the layout and the figure, but also be interested in the typography and take the typography and design it to be one with the figure was a very new thing. And of course, Toulouse-Lautrec a little bit later would be doing the same kind of thing, that was to venture out to doing posters and these kinds of using flat colors and so forth. Notice also really the details of his work. And of course he's taken with the Art Nouveau, which is now coming very much and being fashionable. But notice, for example, the girl's shoulder, how it echoes the F in France, and how the lines and the typography then are wedded together in an interesting way that actually in some ways you see in Toulouse-Lautrec, and then you see the wedding of the two imagery in Cubism earlier on, or in the early part of Cubism. Or you have here a study for a painting that for a poster that he's going to do for the south of France, where he gives it a lot of attention. And then he was also going to be doing theater programs, and he also did sets, and some of the use of distemper, or this whitened glue-based material that both he and especially Vuillard would like, was as a result of doing some of the stage sets and so forth. Can I have the next two, please? Now, in order to contrast the kinds of public screens and huge decorative works that I'm talking about Vuillard, I want to contrast it to some of his more intimist, intimist paintings, for which he's better known, perhaps. There is going to be a very big Vuillard exhibition, which I'm sure everybody is looking forward to. I am next year. A huge retrospective, and I'm sure they're going to be including both these intimist works, some of which, as you know, are just a few inches by a few inches, less than a foot by a foot, and in which, in the 1890s, he was very involved before he had the patronage and the ambitiousness to do the larger works. On the left is a painting called The Landing, Rue de Miromesnil in Toronto, and The Two Doors. And I'm showing you these because he was always aware of the rectangular format of the painting himself, which he would be so use borders with and so forth. But in a way you could say that he is already bordering his work even in these intimist paintings, because he uses a margin that repeats the rectilinearity of the format of the whole canvas here. And of course the door itself. And we know these same kind of playing with shapes, not only in that Vuillard does so well in Hammershøi, but also, of course, Matisse, and also thinking about the theories of Hans Hofmann, of what shape do you have, and how does the interior shape of the imagery interplay with that. And these artists were all very aware of that, whether they were working very small or very, very large. Can I have the next two, please? There's also another side to Vuillard, whether you have the painting called Elegance 1890 on the right, where you have a kind of mysterious side, and on the left, in a painting in the private collection, the Josefovitz collection, The Woman in Red, I'm sorry for the poor slide, where you have an erosion of the figuration itself in a very interesting way that has a big psychological impact that has only begun to be noticed, I think. An art historian named Dario Gamboni has written about this in a really very forceful way, the expressiveness and the expressionistic ideas in Vuillard's work that I think you see in a way intimated in this figure of the woman who becomes, even in the way that the paint itself is laid down, is kind of vulnerable and timid and very interesting. And she's sort of consumed in this red environment. And we'll see other bits of this in a moment. The next two, please. Of course, there's the very famous work in the Museum of Modern Art in New York of Vuillard's mother and sister, where the mother sits very strongly in the black silhouette. The mother was a widower, and Bonnard lived, I'm sorry, this is Vuillard. Have I been saying Bonnard all this time? Okay, thank you. Yes, please. She was a corset maker and not badly off. And on the right, you see he often painted in these small paintings the home domestic interiors, sometimes that seem really almost claustrophobic, where they filled with patterning and dabs of bits of color. And with the sister, who here in the painting on the left all but disappears into the wallpaper and is consumed by the patterning of the house. On the right, he's also showing the same interiors of the home with his sister on the left, and the man peering out from, almost camouflaged really, the sister. But the man peering out is his friend Roussel, who was one of the nabbies who would marry Marie there. So you have in these paintings too a spread over the whole small format of the painting, but these are interior scenes, and in his large decorative paintings he tended to do, not always, but he tended to do these exterior Arcadian, fresh, airy paintings. May I have the next two, please? And on the left, of course, another Vuillard where you have this very strange little interior where his sister, again in this very expressive and expressionistic way, really tilts her head and holds herself in a way that I think is somewhat discomforting. And may I have the next on the left, please? Now, Vuillard had a great patron in Missia Nathanson and her husband. Her husband had gone to school with all these men when they were in the lycée together that I mentioned, and they had a journal called La Revue Blanche, the White Review. And on the left is a portrait of the couple by Vuillard, and on the right is a portrait of Missia by Bonnard, in a poster that he did to advertise La Revue Blanche. And you see, typical of Bonnard is his mischievousness in showing the kind of rascally young boy pointing over to Missia, who is, and again, he's working with the typography. You see her umbrella goes through the A of the La and works itself into this overall design. And typically also he uses a kind of flat silhouetting, which had a lot to do with, by the way, the Indonesian-inspired shadow plays that were quite the rage in the nightclubs of Paris in the 1890s, this idea of silhouetting and sharp silhouettes. So Missia was to become a great patron of both Bonnard and Vuillard for many of the paintings, the larger paintings and the fabulous series of paintings that they would do. So that's introducing Missia. The next two, please. Now, Vuillard did do a series for her called The Album, where there's, again, this kind of visual hide-and-seek, play of hide-and-seek. It's so filled with little bits and colors and so forth that really the figures here are quite camouflaged. I don't know even if you can see the red-headed woman, for example, on the left, and then you kind of make out her dress. They're actually a number of figures in there, but you have to pick them out, even the woman who's seated on the chair on the far right. And the same goes for the painting on the right. There's a kind of horror vacui, abundance of ornamentation in these paintings. But it's also about an enclave, a domestic enclave of cherished bourgeois middle-class pleasure, of comfortable, lovely things, of a closed refuge, of a Paris apartment with domestic tranquility, with these women milling about in this expanse. And the conceptual underpinnings of these kinds of works had very much to do with the idea of the decorative, which was coming more and more to the fore in the 1890s by these various artists. There's a kind of, again, mischievous hide-and-seek game among the patches of close tone color that Vuillard would make again and again one of the ways that he worked. Can I have the next two, please? This is out of place. We saw this border and this painting of looking out the window before, and can I have the next on the left, please? But what I am showing you here in the whole and then in detail is a painting which has been nicknamed The Picnic, which is in the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, where the next step that Vuillard took is introducing the kinds of patching of color that we saw in the album in this larger format painting which is about 10 feet tall, and where you see the close tones of the green and the pink together. And you can, again, barely make out, but when you're studying it in person, you can see little children who are actually playing a kind of hide-and-seek in the trees, and the people about to have a picnic. It's interesting, in this large expanse that you see here of the landscape tilted up, that the figuration on the surface is really almost, in its patterning and so forth, is really very bold. Even though the colors seem subdued, they're very audacious because they're so closely toned. And it's very much like what Rodin was doing at about the same time. Could we have the next two, please? Here is the, on the right is the Vuillard, and on the left in the Musée d'Orsay. Odilon-Redon, as you know, during the first decades of his life, never ventured into color, but did his famous noir, his black paintings. And it was really only when he was 50 that he started to introduce color into his work. And then in the late 1890s, he had some patrons who were interested in his doing multi-paneled works for their homes. And the result is the kind of work you see on the left, where you also see that this was a part of a group of panels, but he did for someone else, another patron, 17 panels, and some of them are very small, as you see on the right. Some of them are long horizontals, some of them are verticals, which would have fit into the the measurements of the room. A critic who didn't like his work, Camille Mauclerc, said, "Oh, but they're so empty." So on the right, can I have the next, please, on the right? And you see then the kind of work that peeved the critic in these late decorative, well, not so late, 1902 till about 1915, he was engaged in these kinds of things. Rodin was, which, as I say, have a kind of similarity formally with the works of Vuillard of about the end of the 19th century. Not necessarily that there was interaction, but it's a real influence, but an interaction maybe. Can we have the next two, please? And then later on, Vuillard continued to do these quite marvelous works, perhaps not as experimental, perhaps not as innovative as his earlier works. I'm showing you the screen, which is the Place de Vintimille, and on the left of 1911, a 5-panel screen, which is in Washington, D.C., and on the right and on the left, showing you within an interior how it folded slightly and so forth. And you would have had a view as if you were looking down into the garden of this public place. Can we have the next two, please? Now, Bonnard, just quickly going to Bonnard, because then I want to dip back, did a number of screens also. Here are 4 together, which have to do with the seasons, which are in the Musée d'Orsay, and his more Japanesey figure of the little a child bending over with his little pail, which is in the Musée d'Orsay, also in Paris. And the nickname among the nabbies for Bonnard was the Japanese nabby. They all had nicknames sort of telling, you know, what typified their work. Can we have the next 2, please? His screens often have this wonderful humor and wit. He was very successful in painting a screen in 1894 called The Nannies on Promenade, and where you have a little boy with a hoop and a kind of a Missia mother-type figure, and then the nurses, and then a frieze of carriages up near the top. And that's very bold, I think, to have the heavier, the incident of bordering on the top with the carriage. And then when you fold it, of course, as you have on this very bad slide on the left that I made, you have more of a sense of cache-cache, of discovering things. Because this was so successful, it was found commercially viable, and in about 2 years later printed 110 of these in lithograph and sold them as a multiple. So he was very keen and clever about marketing himself in that way too. Can I have the next 2, please? Here's the screen again, and tapestries that were engaged in by Maurice Denis on the right, where you have again the borders and the same format that now we're used to seeing, of this tall, narrow format. Can I have the next 2, please? Now, Puvis. How did we get to decorative painting? Pierre Puvis de Chavannes, who I'm going to talk about a moment now, and who introduced many of these ideas, was born much earlier in the century in 1824, and he didn't start painting till 1848, and he never really was member of any group. He was not an impressionist. He did his own thing, and his own thing, by and large, was being very ambitious and doing huge, vast mural cycles for public buildings throughout France, for churches, for museums, particularly many museums, for the Panthéon, for the University of Paris, the Sorbonne, the main lecture room, for city halls. And in order to do these, he developed an interesting style, and I'm showing you an easel painting that he did, perhaps his most famous easel painting on the left, which is called The Poor Fisherman, that dated from 1881. That is just 7 years before these other artists got started. And it was the rage because it was so peculiar, and people didn't know what to make of it. And he himself said when he showed it, this painting jars in the company of other paintings that are well known. And first of all, the narrative was not at all clear, which in itself, of course, it looked like a poor fisherman, but people said, well, it also looks like a Christ-like figure because he has a kind of spiny hair silhouette. Who are the people on the shore? Is it a family? Is it not a family? And a lot of jokes, as you can imagine, were made about the painting. And he really flattened the picture plane, and he developed this kind of neutral, strange, flat, whitened colors and engineered these figures into place as a result of what he had strived to do, and that was make mural paintings that were legible, that were simple, that were two-dimensional, and he did that as a result of the theories at the time of what a mural painting should be and what an easel painting should be. And the person who pointed out the peculiarities of this work, The Poor Fisherman, and went on to articulate a manifesto of what the new nabby art and the new traditions should be, was the artist Maurice Denis, who I said wrote as well as he painted. And he did a painting on the right of 1892 called April, which in all its, in many ways is very similar actually to The Poor Fisherman. Not only is the composition actually similar with this kind of zigzagging thing going back and the whitened figures and the kind of evenness of opaque matte colors, but even that little figure that's picking flowers, that's repeated twice in the Maurice Denis on the right, is a echo of the figure picking flowers on the left in the Puvis de Chavannes. And Maurice Denis said, in viewing and describing the poor fisherman, he launched a very famous manifesto of what the new painting should be, which is probably all known to you. But what usually isn't pointed out is he did this just after describing the poor fisherman. And he said, remember that a painting, before being a war horse, a nude woman, or some anecdote, is essentially a plain surface covered with colors organized in a certain pattern, in a certain order. In other words, a priority of these decorative forms is very important, a priority over subject matter itself. And this all comes about because of what Puvis had developed. Can I have the next two, please? Now, Puvis, as I said, began as a mural painter, and in the 1860s, he wanted to do huge paintings for public places. No one wanted to hire him. So he did, the next best thing is he painted them anyway, and he showed them at the Salon. That is to say, people didn't in France paint directly on the walls because of the humidity, but the whole history of mural painting in the 19th century is painting on canvas and then having the canvas stuck down, as it were, and installed with a white lead. So you could show your paintings and then ship them out to be installed. And that's what Puvis did. He painted the painting on the left on spec, really, and it was called Concordia, or Peace. And then they were bought, his painting, and installed in the museum in Amiens. So he painted a reduced versions of his work, as you see on the right, which he showed in exhibitions so he could become famous, which he was interested in doing. Now, what he did, at Amiens, they removed the border he wanted to have there, but he had his own border in this reduced version, and people said, this is not a regular painting. This is nice, but it's not a regular painting. Théophile Gautier, particularly, who was a great critic at the time, said, this is not a tableau, it is a décoration, because it has a border, and it's opaque, and it's two-dimensional, and I don't know what this person's trying to do, but he's ambitious and he bears watching. But it's not painting, it's decoration, décoration. Can I have the next two, please? And, I'm sorry, can I have the last one back on the right? And in fact, the tapestry, his work was compared to tapestry, and you can see that tends to be the case with the big borders, suggest that it is tapestry. Interestingly, originally, tapestry had borders because it was imitating paintings, by the way, because paintings in medieval times, in the early Renaissance, had a far higher status than tapestries did, so they were imitative in that way. And Puvis, as you can see, well, I don't know if you can see, but he really uses much less modeling than you would normally have in a painting, and is very legible as a result. But you do have the forms themselves, say the nude figure in the center becomes much stronger and outlined, and the colors tend to ride on the pictorial surface. Now, to us, it may look old hat, but at the time, if you can think in your mind of traditional paintings with their glazes and so forth, it looked very, very new. Can I have the next two, please? He also used these great borders when he did, for example, the painting you see on the right, which is one of two for the Marseille Museum. This one was called Marseille as a Greek colony, which he also had this border around. And can I have the next on the right? I think I got something out of order. Yes, and down at the bottom, there was a very famous series of caricatures of all the latest work when it was shown at the Salon. And the caricaturist, in this case, not only caricatures Puvis painting, but also caricatures the border, which he makes into a border of onions, and suggesting that the border smells and so forth. And showing in the caricatures, they often point out what was sort of new and original and disconcerting about any of the artist's work. And in this case, the Marseille, clearly one of the problems with it was its borders, with the painted borders. Next two, please. But Puvis continued to use borders, as you see here, and even as studies for larger works. They were intrinsic to them, so he included them in the studies. And can I have the next on the left, please? And in his huge pleasant land, or sweet land, Du Pays of 1882, now we're getting into the 1880s, where these artists are just about to take off, and as young students are looking at what's going on around them, and no one was more famous at the time than Puvis. He did this painting where the figures are about life size on the left, and he included the borders as being very important to his work, and sort of finishing them off just as a present is wrapped nicely, and controlling the outer perimeter of his work. You have these borders. They're usually not photographed when you see photographs of these works, which is unfortunate, because he said, I put great store in my borders. Can we have the next on the right, please? Now, when, for example, young Seurat, the year after this was shown, 2 years later, presented his early work, this is called The Bather's Anière, he was called a modernizing Puvis by the critics. And actually, if you follow the composition, even to the sailboat and to the sharp, crisp kind of horizontal line there, and if you see this way this figure is holding her knees, and the way that the figure theirs are holding their knees, and the kind of repetitions of forms, you can see that there's similarity, as well as the whole flattening and the rhythmic spacing out at a certain beat and a certain patterning of these figures that don't come together and don't really interact in any narrative way. Because for narrative, in all these decorative paintings, when you have a narrative or you have a theatrical or psychological interaction, you actually need to have figures turn to one another or somehow react and act out as in a theatrical presentation, something that's going on. And if you're more interested in how you, at what rhythm and at what regular beat you lay out figures, as you have in the Seurat, or you have here, you have these isolated singular figures, and you don't have them interacting and involved, and you have them stiffen up. And so part of the decorative aesthetic is when you have these prevalent rhythms that any of these artists are trying to institute, you cannot have the figures gather together and cluster and space out according to the story, but you have to seek them where you will. Can we have the next two? Now, the borders were important to Seurat, and he started instituting in 1889 his borders, which are I think, very much an imitation of Puvis' borders, and went back to some of his earlier paintings and actually had them restretched so that they would have more canvas at the end and introduced borders in them later. This is Puvis' Sacred Wood, a famous painting for his hometown museum in Lyon, and unfortunately a horrible slide, where you see the Arcadianism with which he's very much associated in his paintings, and that Seurat also, with these kind of stiff figures very much like Puvis, took over. Can I have the next on the right, please? And in Seurat, you have these borders, for example, the 1889 work. His work also was compared, by the way, to tapestry. Not in an uncomplimentary way, but just saying it looks like tapestry. And in fact, the stitching of color and the little color points, in fact, do have a sense almost of the weaving of tapestry with different points of color coming in, the woof and the web, etc. Can the next on the right, please? This is a reduced version of the Puvis, the Sacred Wood, on the right, where you can see even more clearly. It's in the Chicago Art Institute. something of the way the figures are laid out, and the way that the decorative sense to it, which with the flowers all over that make it not only look like tapestry, but what the young painters, when they were looking to models to follow, is very different from Impressionism. Everything's kind of statically locked into place and engineered, as I said. And you don't have the sense of the freshness and recording the everyday world as it passes and the movement that you have in the Impressionist work. But Monet, at about the same time, started to be accused of being decorative too, and taking into account a kind of all-overness, which, as we're already so late, we can't bear to get into, but everyone was talking about decoration at this time. Can we have the next two, please? Let's see, the next on the right, please. Puvis took into account the givens of the buildings, the architecture that he was decorating, and in that sense, he was said to be subservient to the architecture, and that's why people said mural painting isn't like real painting, where the artist decides what shall be. In mural painting, the mural is subordinate to the architecture, and therefore it's a lesser, it came with a sort of somewhat lesser status in that sense, although it was considered the most ambitious. Now, Puvis did one cycle outside of France, and that's in the Boston Public Library, which you see on the left. And he keyed the colors to the marble. He never came to the United States, but he had bits of marble sent to him so he could key his colors to it. Just as in Lyon, you see on the right, I photographed with the pilaster that's a kind of pinky color. And you can see not only the pink introduced into the painting of the Antique Vision, but even the sort of horizontals of the bottom of the molding is introduced in the geological formation of the landscape. It's not geologically correct as much as it's meant to match what young architecture students drawing and looking at trees, and a young child looking at nature for the first time, all of which is part of the experience of becoming an artist. But he melds together fine arts and these applied arts, in other words, doing the ceramics. Now, the Rouen Museum, for which this was, had a big collection of ceramics, and so it was celebrated there. But it was really very innovative to meld these arts all as if they were one and should be of the same status, and that the artists were one. The craftspeople aren't doing tedious, laborious work, but are rather out having a wonderful bucolic time at it. Can we have the next on the right? And of course, the rhythms of the whole. I just wanted to point simply to the curved, to the shape of these canvases. This is a Virgil on the right, and I can't go into it much more at this point. You see a detail of this is the great poets Virgil, Aeschylus, and Homer. But seeing these kinds of shaped canvases was to influence the younger artists as well. Can we have the next two, please? So that you have, for example, Homer by Puvis on the right, and you have Xavier Roussel, who is one of the nabis, doing these, and notice the border on his work, doing an Arcadian scene. It's very much influenced by the kind of work that Puvis was doing. And can we have the next on the right, please? And notice the whitened Puvis, so that you have, this is The Rape of the Daughters of Leucippus by Roussel, who is married to Vuillard's sister, as I said. And let me just finish by showing a number of works, and then if you'd like to discuss it at all, I think that's probably what we'll do. Can I have the next two, please? So you have some more Roussel on the right, and showing Maurice Denis and how he ornamented his, even in his small works, he took to painting his borders within the work itself, as you see. This is Two Sisters of 1894 by Maurice Denis. May I have the next two, please? Maurice Denis also did wallpaper designs. This is two fragments of his wallpaper designs from a museum I photographed that's devoted to Denis, which I recommend to you, on Saint-Germain-en-Laye, which is outside of Paris. It's an old priory, which is now a Maurice Denis museum, which is quite wonderful. On the left is and you see, of course, the Art Nouveau influence in his wallpaper. On the left is a very large painting by him with nearly life-size figures of women ascending a ladder in foliage, which is, the motif itself also is based on a Puvis motif, actually, which I'm in Inter Artis at Naturum. I meant to point out the woman with the ladders. Well, there's another one too. Anyway, with the next two, please. Or you have the Muses by Maurice Denis on the right of 1894, where you notice the way that the very Gauguin-like flowers, not only in the trees up above, but they become actually almost literally a carpet underneath. And those kinds of flowers that are very Gauguin-like also, I meant to show you in Du Pays, they're very similar to what Puvis had strived to do as well. And here's a Puvis de Chavannes bucolic painting from the 1890s too, where you see the way he was developing his Arcadian scene. The next two, please. The next one on the right, let's just... When Maurice Sauf then asked Bonnard to do a painting, still another painting for his house, he did these three panels of the Mediterranean on the right, and they were to be separated by columns, very much as Puvis had this whole set of mural panels, which are on the Panthéon in Paris, where when the murals by Bonnard were separated by these engaged columns, the landscape vista would seem like a panorama to pass behind the columns, as they do in these three separated paintings by Puvis in Paris, where you have, notice in the Puvis, the rhythm of the trees and the silhouetting, all those things that were picked up also by the younger artists, as well as these kind of pastel colors that interlocked. Can I have the next, please? And finally, Bonnard did this really wild set of paintings for Monsieur Nathanson, who had divorced and was married to a richer husband still, and then was to do it to a richer husband still after that. But while she was married to the second husband, she commissioned a set of 14 feet high paintings. And you have Bonnard doing these extremely wild, wonderful paintings with borders now that take off on their own. They're filled with monkeys and pearls. The Gloria Groom, who put together the exhibition in Beyond the Easel, looked into why these pearls are kind of look as if they're falling apart, and suggests that perhaps Bonnard knew that the marriage wasn't doing well, and so you have pearls flung all over the place and so forth. But you have a very flamboyant, huge mural-sized paintings, which were for patrons and not simply easel paintings, and very much fulfilled this decorative aesthetic. And I think there's one or two more. Is that it? Yeah, and then I just wanted to show you this last one, where much of the wit and humor and lightheartedness of these decorative works are seen in this one of these set of paintings, where you have the little children gambling in the water, and even a little child sort of with her behind up towards the viewer, and all kinds of incidents happening in this glorious painting. So that's a little taste of the decorative painting at the end of the 19th century and then into the 20th. Thank you.